Good. What we're going to be doing in this module is that we're going to give you a bit of a review of the COBIT foundation concepts. So this is always a great module in order to start preparing for the next course, is to do a bit of recap. I know that all of you have done the foundation course quite some months ago, so it could be that some of these elements have been slipping away, or that they have not been, they're not at the top of your mind anymore. So in the first module of today's course, what we're going to be doing is recap a little bit on the core COBIT principles. If you've not taken the exam yet, then this is also a very good recap, because it's going to show you exactly what do you need to study for in terms of the COBIT foundation examination. So let's get started and see what this is going to be all about. So as you know from COBIT, every new module will start with some learning objectives. And these learning objectives are then ultimately going to be covered within the exam itself. So we'll start today with reviewing a little bit of the structure of COBIT, that is known as the COBIT 2019 architecture. And we're also going to be looking at what were the different governance and management objectives again. So I hope you still remember from the foundation course that we had one domain of governance objectives. And remember that we called that EDM. And we had 4 domains of different management objectives, which is the core model that we're going to see a recap on in a second. Then we're going to dive into the governance system again and look at some of the design factors and focus areas within the framework itself. So to be very brief, it's going to be a bit of a review of the foundation course and will help you to outline some of the most important topics that are part of the COBIT framework. Good. Let's get started with a quick review of the way that COBIT 2019 is structured and what are the core elements which are going to be part of this module itself. So the next slide always looks a little bit complicated, but I think it always very clearly shows how COBIT is structured and what have been some of the main ideas around how this new version has been set up. So note that the topic of this course is COBIT 2019, which is the latest version of the COBIT foundation or of the COBIT framework as it's being used in enterprises today. This COBIT 29 methodology is primarily based on what is known as the core of COBIT, and this is the framework with those 40 different governance and management objectives. We'll do a quick review of those elements as well. So note that COBIT 2019 is not something new in the sense that there have been many versions of COBIT previously to COBIT 2019. So all of the input to the current framework is what you see on the left-hand side. So previous versions like COBIT 5, but also even COBIT 4.3. Other standards and regulatory requirements, like, for instance, the ISO 27000 standards that we already discussed, but also white papers, peer reviews, contributions from individual community members. That is the core of COBIT. So note that in your foundation course, we looked at the framework and specifically at what were the core aspects of that. And what was the introduction and the COBIT methodology. So I'm hoping that that is familiar by now. What we are going to focus on in this program, let me see if I can quickly shift to the other side. You see me jumping around now, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, so the other side is what we see right here. And this is where we are moving towards design and implementation. So this is going to be the focus of this course. And this is also, as I just mentioned, the two books that we're going to be discussing is, first of all, the design guide, and second of all, the implementation guide, which are going to be available in your ISACA environment. So where this course is going to be completely different is that we are going to not just focus around the theory, we're going to be focusing more around the practical aspects, and we're going to be focusing not just on what, but specifically around how. And in order to do that, we're going to be looking at tailoring the system toward your own organization. So as we've seen already a number of times before, COBIT is not some kind of a one-size-fits-all. Ultimately, COBIT needs to be tailored towards your own form of organization and your own practices, your own processes. So that is what is going to make it practical for everyone involved. Good, so that's going to be the main objective. Let's review a little bit on the COBIT products. So I showed you those on the previous slide. So in total, there are four main aspects that are going to be required to know for this course. Note that in Foundation, we already reviewed the introduction as well as the different control objectives. So the main purpose of the COBIT design and implementation course is going to be around the design guide, which we see right over here, as well as the implementation guide. And in the first part of the course, we're going to focus around the design guide. And in the second part of the course, we're going to be focusing on the implementation guide. Very briefly stated, these are the textbooks which are underneath the course and that they provide the information and theory related towards this specific module of the framework itself. Good. Any questions so far before we move towards a quick review of the COBIT core methodology? No, so far so good?
Yeah.
Great. In that case, we're going to have a quick look at the COBIT governance and management objectives. And what I'm hoping is that this should be completely clear for now. So remember, some of the main definitions that we have seen in Foundation is that ultimately what we're trying to achieve with COBIT is that we find a structured methodology so that information and technology is going to contribute towards enterprise goals. And remember that in the Foundation course, we talked about something which was known as the goals cascade. So how do you move down from your enterprise goals and objectives all the way towards the more detailed technology components and ultimately COBIT controls based upon the strategic orientation of your organization. So in other words, in COBIT, everything needs to be related towards each other. Everything should ultimately be derived from your strategy and should cascade down towards the smallest individual components. So note and that there are a couple of key elements that we discussed in the Foundation course, and that means that ultimately every objective, whether it's a governance or management objective, always relates back to one or more related components so that they will help you achieve that specific objective. The second part is that within COBIT, there is a very clear distinction between governance and management. So again, don't confuse the two. Governance is around setting direction and monitoring and controlling the organization, whereas management is the more day-to-day objective that teams take in order to deliver specific results. That also means that there's going to be a separation in terms of roles and responsibilities. So governance processes are typically managed by the board or very senior management, and the management processes are typically the domain of senior managers as well as middle management. The strategic orientation is always a little bit more related towards what is the future and where do we want to be. Whereas in management, we are way more looking at the shorter term goals and how are we going to make sure that we achieve specific objectives within a limited period of time. So those are going to be the main difference. I hope that everyone still remembers that from the first course that you've been part of. Good. A bit of a recap then around the different governance and management objectives. So remember that this was called the COBIT core based on the model that we see right here. So I'm going to go back one quick slide and show you that there is one specific governance domain. And remember that we call that EDM, which stands for evaluate, direct, and monitor. And this objective was to steer the organization towards the future. In EDM, the responsibility typically lies with the board. And with the board, we are going to set the controls and the strategy for the organization. Underneath that, there were 4 management objectives, and these 4 management objectives range from very strategic to a little bit more operational. So a good way that I always use to memorize it is that if you look at align, plan, and organize, is that these are the more strategic objectives. Build, acquire, and implement is a little bit more tactical objectives, whereas deliver, service, and support is the more operational objectives. And then monitor, evaluate, and assess basically goes across all of the other 3 domains and puts monitoring and evaluation in place for both the strategic, tactical, and operational domains. So that is what monitor, evaluate, and assess will do. If we look at that from a little bit more of a detailed point of view, you can see that this structure is completely embedded within the COBIT core. So remember, the COBIT core is the main model that we see within COBIT. And at this highest level, we see 5 different layers or 5 different levels included, and we call that EDM. And there was a very simple rule of thumb with which you could memorize that. And that rule of thumb is something that I always kind of use as a bit of a cheat sheet for everyone that wants to memorize it. Note that there are 5 EDM controls, and all of those will start with the word ensured. I'm highlighting it right now. I hope you can read it because it's a little bit of a small slide. But the word ensured, as you can see right here, kind of gives you an already immediately an indication that this is going to be one of the EDM domains. All of the other controls will start with the word managed, and therefore it's very easy to separate between the 2. So it makes it quite simple to see which kind of control we're talking about. Note that in this course and in the design and implementation course, we are not going to go into too much detail around each of these individual controls itself, because we've already covered that in foundation. So in foundation, we've discussed the structure of all of the different controls. But in this course, we're going to be more looking at how do you determine whether a control is relevant, and if you have selected a particular control, how are you going to ensure that this can be implemented in a good way and in a very structured manner. So those are going to be the main topics that are going to be the part of the discussion this morning. Good. I'm going to zoom in a little bit because the last slide was not very readable in terms of the font size. So note that within COBIT, and within the COBIT core model, we are basically covering all of the different aspects that an organization would like to have under control in order to align their IT solutions and services with the ultimate organizational strategy that an organization has. And that starts all the way at the top. If you look, for instance, at elements like framework setting and benefits delivery, as well as managing risk, all the way towards more operational processes, like, for instance, this is ITIL service management, operations management, but also things like problem management. These are the more operational processes, and then everything in between. Note that it's not going to be a requirement that you memorize all of the 40 different controls. What is going to be relevant is that you have the ability to make a decision whether that control is going to be relevant for your organization or not. And that's a decision that you would need to discuss, or that you would need to evaluate with your organization itself, because it will be a choice to what level and to what level of maturity you would like to have these controls involved. So let me ask a quick question. Does anybody already know to what extent you would like to have your COBIT controls already selected?
We don't have it yet. I guess for my team.
Okay. So that's going to be the next question, right?
Actually, yeah. Actually, we plan to work with the IT security for the implementation.
Yeah. So then you're going to be looking at the security aspects specifically. So let me show you where that is. So this is going to be very related towards security. Risk management is obviously a main input towards security as well. And then we have more operational processes, like, for instance, managed security services that you see right here, but also change management, which are going to be directly related towards your managed security controls. So from a security point of view, these would be very good controls to then focus on. Does that make sense?
Yes. By the way, Jen, I also saw BAI 11 manage a project.
Yeah.
So this element is focused on project implementation, right?
Yeah, correct. Specifically project management, project implementation, but always taking into account what COBIT is trying to achieve is control of project management. So again, BAE 11 is not going to give you an indication on what project management methodology you should use, whether it's Prince2 or PMI or Agile. But what it does require you to do is have control over your projects. So in BAE 11 under managed projects, you're going to ensure that you have the proper processes, structure, roles and responsibilities, as well as tools and technology to measure whether you have your projects under control. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
A bit clearer.
Good. Good. So that was a bit of a recap of the main aspects of the COBIT core and the framework itself. Then let's also review the different components of a governance system. So remember from the foundation course that the controls and the COBIT core is, I would say, the most fundamental model that you see in the COBIT framework. But you should always be able to place it in the right kind of context. And that right kind of context is set by the different components that we see as part of the governance system. So let's review that a little bit more in detail. So in order for every organization to use COBIT successfully, they need to be able to apply, adopt, and adapt it towards their specific organization. And the keyword that we will see throughout the whole course is that we would need to establish, but more importantly, tailor a governance system. And I want you to pay a specific attention to the word tailor, because with tailor, we mean adjusting it. As I mentioned earlier in the course, COBIT is not one size fits all. It's around how do you change the specific elements in such a way that you build something which is suitable for your own organization. And this is a very common mistake, and which I've seen in a lot of COBIT implementations as well, is that people think that COBIT is all about controls and meeting those controls. But it's actually a very flexible framework. It really helps you to adjust and ensure that you adapt the framework towards your own organizational needs. I really want to kind of stress this right at the start of this program, because we're going to be talking a lot more around design and implementation components, but the tailoring aspect is going to be very, very crucial. So the way that we're going to be looking at that are the different components, and the components itself are different factors that will contribute to good operations of your governance system. And each of those components will interact with each other, as we will see in the next few minutes. Ultimately, if we take the COBIT controls that we've seen on the 40 controls that we've seen on the previous few slides, and then we adjust or tailor them through the different components of your governance system, then we are going to be focusing on a more integrated and integral approach. And within COBIT, we frequently refer to this as the holistic approach. It is the one uniform way in which we're going to be dealing with governance of enterprise IT. That's the whole objective of what we're trying to establish. Good. Let's review a little bit around what those different components were. The component that almost everyone is most familiar with is obviously the processes, because the processes is the part that COBIT is most known for. It's also what other methodologies like ITIL or TOGAF or other kind of best practice frameworks are very much focused on, is around the processes. The processes are a very integral part of the governance system. There's no way around that. So it's also not the case that with COBIT 2019, we say the processes don't matter anymore, but it's part of something larger. And the governance system, as you see right here with the 7 different components, is going to be applicable for the way that you structure each of your governance control areas. So let me explain what I mean with that. So for every specific governance control, so let's take, for example, the example that we just manage projects. If we want to establish that control, we need to think about its processes, but we also need to think about organizational structure, information flows and items, and all of the different components that you see right here on this slide. So processes is an integral part of that, but it's not the only part, because, for instance, as I just mentioned with managed projects, you also would like to know that you have the right tools and technology to measure whether your projects are on track. You also want to make sure that you have people who are skilled and knowledgeable in project management, so they know exactly what they need to do. You need to have the right kind of certifications. You want to make sure that we follow project management according to specific principles or procedures, that there is good information available, that we have adequately trained and qualified project managers that have the right kind of level of mandate, and that there's a culture in place which will drive a good project management behavior as well as the right kind of ethics to do projects in the long run. So what this slide is trying to explain to you is that in order to build a governance system, you require more than processes. And again, this is a common mistake that I see in a lot of organizations, is that they focus on the process aspect only. But there's much more that comes into play, and especially the culture, ethics, and behavior, or things like organizational structures, are very, very fundamental to setting up a good governance system. Without those, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, in order to achieve specific results. And that's the kind of level that I want you to start thinking in, because this will significantly help you to understand what you would need to create, but also what you would need to build in order to set up a proper governance system. And obviously that's complex, but yeah, that's also the reason that we're in this course. If it would be super simple, then every company would have this by now fully optimized. But I can assure you that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done within this specific area. Any questions around these components of the governance system?
Jen, just
Yes.
have one funny question, but I hope you can explain. The question is that do we have a tool from the COBIT toolkit? Is that any tool or checklist for me
Yeah.
or for somebody else to help kinds of access the competency or competency requirement for the rule for the people?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Unfortunately, the answer is no. So what you will see in the tool and the toolkit that we're going to discuss later in the program is that it's going to be mostly focused around processes, as well as more kind of structural questions. But it's not going to give you exactly how do you assess people's skills and competencies. It is going to ask you around whether you have that in place, but in order to actually do assess the skills and competencies, you will need to use a different framework or different methodology in order to do that. In my experience, however, it is actually quite simple to do that, because as soon as you have identified which control areas you would like to have in place and what are the roles and responsibilities that are necessary to operate the governance system, it's very straightforward to determine what would be the kind of competencies you would need in every domain. There are a couple of very good methodologies for doing that. The ones that I personally like most is SFIA, which is the Skills Framework for the Information Age, which is a UK-based approach. Another very good competency framework is the European Competency Framework, which is ECF, which I, in the very early days, helped to develop, but it's more of a European-based approach. So my recommendation would be is to use an existing best practice in order to set up this specific component. In the toolkit that we're going to discuss in this course, unfortunately, it's not going to be just handed on a silver platter saying, you know, you should ask these kinds of questions to assess the people skills aspect. But it's something that you would need to fill in through a different kind of best practice. Does that answer your question? It's probably not the answer you were hoping for, but
yeah. I don't know. It's try to have exact answer, but yeah, I understand that is would be a challenge to access competency transfer for the people enrolled. Jen, based on your experience, we all know that there's no one size fit for IT organization structure. So based on your recommendation, how could we access whether or not the structure is fit for the purpose, or it's not too big for the organization, or small or too small for the organization? How could we access based on this?
That is actually a very interesting question. So how do you find a governance structure that is fit for purpose? Well, it has a little bit to do with experience and also with a more long-term strategic planning. So the core starting point that I always start with is by looking at the business and corporate strategy for a longer period of time, let's say the next 3 to 5 years. What is the ambition? What are the growth paths? What is the strategic direction that the organization is going to be going? Based upon that, you can fairly quickly assess what are going to be your enterprise goals. And from those enterprise goals, as you've seen in the foundation course, you can cascade down towards your more operational controls as well as the different processes. So that is going to give you an overview of what are the elements that you would like to have in control. Then the second question is, well, what is too large or too little? So what I typically use as a rule of thumb is pick 7 to 8 different governance areas that are going to be your key focus for a specific year. It's not to say that you cannot do anything else, but pick 7 or 8 which are going to be your core focus areas, and that you're going to actively push to improve those core controls. Then during that year, you will start to see maturity as well as the different elements of those 7 to 8 controls rise. And in the meantime, you will also see smaller steps in other kinds of controls. Why? Because all of the controls in the governance system are obviously related to each other. But by focusing around 7 to 8, that's where you will see the biggest progress within those domains which are most relevant for your organization today. Then the second year, choose 7 or 8 new controls. They could be the same as you had some of them from the previous year, or you could add another key element that is going to be the focus areas. So what I typically do is I put on a big board in the office that these are going to be the core controls or objectives that we would like to focus on in a specific year, so that everyone is familiar around what is going to be the main priorities. As we've seen, it's impossible to focus on all 40 in total. Most people cannot even memorize 40 controls by heart. And I would also struggle to kind of list all of them from memory. But what people can do and can memorize is around 7 or 8 that are going to be the main objective for a specific year. So from my experience, that is a very workable, very practical way in order to deliver this and to raise the necessary kind of focus. Does that clarify a bit?
I got some because based on the experience and maturities of people and organization to do the assessment.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
So it's helping them, I would say, significantly to focus on the right things at the right time in the organization.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jay.
You're very welcome. Good. So those are the different components. So again, note that the components are aspects that are part of your governance system. Then another key term that was introduced to you during the foundation course was called design factors. And the design factors are aspects which are going to be used and are going to be typically input towards your governance system. So the components itself are basically the building blocks that you will use in order to structure your governance system. The design factors are organization-specific elements which will tailor your governance system. This is also the explanation that helps you understand why every governance system is going to be different for every organization, and how you can help and how you can determine the specific elements that will form the input towards your governance system. And on this slide, you see a bit of a recap of all of the different design factors that exist. And I hope you still remember that in the foundation course, you kind of covered all of these design factors a lot more in detail. So let me highlight some of the elements that will be an input towards your governance system. So very clearly, your enterprise strategy and enterprise goals, that's kind of the main element to get started with. They will determine for a very significant extent what structure, what kind of controls, but also how formal your governance system will need to be. If you are, let's say, in a financially regulated environment like you are, then the enterprise strategy and enterprise goals will be much more, I would say, strict and much more focused around risk and around compliance than, for instance, an organization that operates in a non-regulated environment. So it means you will have a different strategy. It means you will make different choices towards the future. And those design factors will have a significant influence on the way that you will set up and structure your governance system. Organizations additionally will have different forms of risk profiles. So what is the amount of risk that they are comfortable with? But also very much closely related to this is how many threats do they receive? So you can imagine that in, again, more of a financial institution will have much more threats and will have much more, I would say, risks of being targeted than an organization which is, let's say, just in the food and beverage industry. So all of these different design factors will help you to ask the right kind of questions around how your governance framework should be structured. Other considerations, and I'm just kind of randomly picking some, are, for instance, what is your sourcing model? So are you insourcing, outsourcing? Do you develop a lot of applications yourself? Do you have everything in a cloud? Those will be decisions that will have an impact on the way your governance structure is going to be, needs to be set up and needs to be tailored. Again, remember from the foundation course that there were all kinds of predetermined design factors that you could evaluate, which will help you to think about what kind of choices you would like to make when setting up your governance framework. So how does that work in a practical sense? Well, before you start defining which of those 40 different control areas you would like towards which specific maturity, you need to ask yourself questions around: what is the role of IT? Which risks do I have? What is my IT implementation methods? These questions, and you could do that with a simple questionnaire or interviews, will give you the required input to define your governance system in the second stage. So you could say that this is kind of like a preliminary exercise to ensure that you set up the right kind of governance system. And this is a very good way to start. So it kind of builds upon the question that you asked earlier around how do I tailor it to ensure that it's not too much, but also not too little. The design factors will also be able to help you with answering a number of these questions. Does that come back to memory a little bit from the foundation course?
Definitely yes for me.
Good. That's very great to hear. Thanks so much. Good. And then the last key area, and this is new, by the way, in COBIT 2019. It was not present in COBIT 5 or any of the previous versions, is the focus areas. Focus areas are, I would say, a little bit more of a complex aspect within the COBIT framework, but it basically means an area of specialization. So that's a way that I typically like to describe it, because it basically brings together a functional group. Area of specialization or functional group typically means that people in a team focus on a specific element. I'm quite sure, I was obviously not one of the authors of COBIT, but I'm quite sure that the people who did also looked at this from a very practical side. Means that ultimately in an organization, it will be people in teams that will need to look at governance. And it's very useful if there is a team which will focus on COBIT within a specific element. So a very good example that we saw earlier in the course this morning is, let's focus, for instance, on cybersecurity. And if we focus on cybersecurity, then we will have a number of people who are going to be involved with cybersecurity. And within this focus area, we are going to look at which governance and management objectives will help us specifically with cybersecurity. So as I showed you in the slides earlier, within the domain of cybersecurity, we're going to obviously look at managed risks. We're going to be looking at setting up the operational security processes. You could even look at things like incident management or problem management, because that also ties towards cybersecurity risk. So the way to look at focus areas is basically a logical grouping, typically based on specialization or a specific team focus. So to kind of give you another example, let's say that we have a project management team. Then they will select a different number of controls and a different number of elements that they are going to focus on. If there's a service management team or a DevOps team, they will focus on another number of controls. So the way to really look at focus areas is that it's a logical grouping, typically based on the way that your organization is structured. And that also makes them quite complex, because within COBIT, there's no uniform guidance around what you should or shouldn't do when it comes towards focus areas. What COBIT only says is that the number of focus areas is unlimited, and you can set it up and tailor it exactly towards your own preferences and perceptions, and that it's, for that reason, open-ended. So that's why a lot of people struggle a little bit with the focus areas, because there's no additional guidance on this. But my advice is always look at this as at a very practical and pragmatic point of view. In an organization, teams are typically structured around functional capability. So let's say a technology team, RPA team, network team, cybersecurity team. They will logically focus on the areas that are going to be within their level of expertise. And I think that if you look at it that way, that makes it very practical and also quite easy to explain and understand. That makes sense?
Yep.
Good. Then I'm going to go towards one last kind of element to kind of recap around the COBIT foundation aspects. So you see that I'm going through this quite quick, but it helps you because we've seen this in foundation already quite in detail, but it helps you kind of understand what was the key aspects that we focus on. The last main element is all about performance. And what we want to do in COBIT is to look at how can we be better over time. Performance and performance management are going to be very significant parts of this design and implementation course. So we're going to be focusing around capability levels. And remember that a capability is the ability to do something. So it gives you actually an indication of how able and how capable are you. And we are going to be looking at the different maturity levels. And maturity levels, remember, were based on a scale of 0 to 5. That basically looks at what is the maturity of a specific process or a specific area or a specific element. Take into account that capability levels is one level of abstraction higher, because in order to be capable, let's say, at incident management, you need incident processes which are at a high maturity level, but you also need staff with the right kind of skills and knowledge and to deal with incidents. You need systems which are going to be configured in order to deal with your processes. So maturity is a little bit more straightforward, whereas capability and the ability to do something is much more difficult in practice. but it's good to differentiate between the two. COBIT, and especially COBIT 2019, is fully set up and structured to be measurable. And I personally really like that because it makes it very practical for an organization. Framework is, in my opinion, not very useful if it's a one-time exercise. And by having this as a capability model and as something which is measurable, really will help you to use COBIT long-term, because there's always going to be something that you can improve. So by setting it up in this way, you have a reliable and repeatable methodology, which also is very much results focused, and that can show how the capability and the maturity levels of an organization will evolve over a specific area of time. And that will really help you. Within COBIT, we refer to this as COBIT performance management. You can see that on the right-hand side of the slide. Let me highlight that real quick for you. So COBIT performance management is basically looking at how do we not just design a governance system and look at what we need to do, but also how do we make this a structural part that we can improve over time. And so looking at capability maturity assessments is going to be an integral part of that. We're obviously going to talk way more about that in the rest of this program, but I do think that this is a really essential element that you should be focusing on right from the start. Good. The capability model that we're going to be looking at is in line with the 5 levels of CMMI. You probably have seen this in many other IT frameworks as well. ITIL, for example, uses the same basis, so it's also based on CMMI development parts. So take into account, again, the difference between capabilities and maturity. So we are going to be looking at process activities which are associated with capability levels, but which are generally considered a subset. Other aspects besides process are, for instance, skills, knowledge, technology aspects that are in place. Because those are going to be very organization specific and very much tailored, you won't find any book or guidance that says, well, you should have this level of knowledge. It's kind of basically the question that we've seen before. However, from a process point of view, it's relatively simple because processes are very measurable, and it helps you to very quickly assess what the maturity of an individual process will be. Remember that process maturity was defined in the governance and management objectives publication, where you will see exactly which level will be used for which individual process. Okay? So that's the main difference between the two. So to look at it a little bit more in detail, so what you will see is that we will look at specific elements within the COBIT maturity model. We will look at maturity as a whole, which includes aspects like the processes that we've seen before. And within the process capability that we see right over here, and I'm just going to focus on the COBIT updates because that's what we're going to focus on in this part, is that we will have multiple capabilities that need to be at a certain level of maturity in order to be capable at something. And again, a process is an integral part of that, but not the only part. And what I see very frequently in organizations is that people are too fixated and too focused only around the process, whereas there are a lot of other components involved. Think about your people, your knowledge, your skills, your technology, your tools, your environment, your ethics, the organizational culture. There's so much more that comes into play. And that's something that we need to consider in order to be truly capable or truly mature in a specific area. So within an organization, don't just focus on process maturity only. See it as something important, but in the context of a bigger picture, in the context of something that is larger for a specific organization. Okay? If you think about it this way, it becomes easier to explain it, but it also helps you, I think personally, to start seeing the bigger picture of why these things matter and why they are relevant for measuring how you can progress as an organization. I typically like to say you can have all your processes at level 5 and still not perform according to expectations, because that means your focus is only around the process part, but you're blatantly disregarding any of the other components that we've seen so far. And basically that will make you focus on kind of the too narrow-minded, too much towards one area only. Does that help? Does that help you relate how the different aspects come together?
Sorry, Chen, can you back to the previous slide?
Sure.
What stands for CMMI 2.0?
Yeah. So CMMI stands for the Capability Maturity Model, or officially stands for the Carnegie Mellon Maturity Index, which is what the university that originally invented it. CMMI is, I would say, an industry best practice towards different capability levels. It's actually a good question because it brings me towards my next slide. Because what you see right here is capability maturity levels based on CMMI. So CMMI, Carnegie Mellon Maturity Index, is an approach which basically says, well, in order to measure process capability, we're going to be looking at 5 different levels. And that means that you count 0 as something which is non-existent, but it's specifically used to measure the maturity of processes. So if we look at the level 0, and let me basically highlight that, is that at level 0, we say that there's a lack of any basic capability. So there's no process in place, there's nothing documented, there's nothing that we can rely back on. At level 1, there is a process, but it's more intuitive, so it's not very organized. So these are processes that people follow because of routine, but they have not ever written it down anywhere, or it's not embedded into the system, so it's in people's minds. At level 2, there is a basic process, so typically there is some form of documentation, there is some form of a defined process, but it's ad hoc and it doesn't really deliver structurally the results that you want to have. At level 3, we say that there's a very much a defined process. So the process is there, it achieves its objectives, it's measured regularly in order to see whether it adheres towards where we want to be. At level 4, we're going to actively use the process to achieve a purpose. So this is typically where I say that we start to include feedback. And it means that at that moment onwards, we are using the output of processes in order to make improvements towards the process itself. So there's this continual learning curve that will make your process better over time. And at level 5, and take into account that level 5 is an end state, basically it means that you continually improve your process based on activities, outputs, performance, and that continual improvement is basically embedded right from the very start. So that's what we see right here. So this is process capability, and this is process, and that's an integral part of the maturity itself. And this model is based on CMMI. So it's not exactly the same, but I would say 90% has been adopted and adapted from the CMMI methodology. And this is what is also being used in COBIT. So when you do a process assessment within COBIT, each of the processes of the 40 that you have under of the 40 controls, within each of those controls, there's a process. And each of those processes will then be measured. So you're measuring fundamentally a subset of your entire capability. But because processes are there for every organization, it becomes a good starting point, because it's way more difficult to measure things like culture or tools or technology, etc. Does that make sense? And did it answer your previous question as well? Good. Good. So then we have the focus areas. So remember that the focus areas were for specific elements of focus. And here again, you see the difference, if I go back one slide, between process capability as well as focus maturity levels. And the maturity levels are going from incomplete, basically means there's nothing there, all the way towards optimizing. And in between there, we have the initial stage, managed, defined, and quantitative, meaning, again, with quantitative, with that, there is a feedback loop that helps over time. Since a process capability is a part of your maturity, it will very significantly help you to assess at which maturity an organization is actually operating. However, again, take into account that you could have your process, if I go back one slide, at level 5, but because process is only one specific element, it could be that your entire maturity is still at level 3 or maybe even at level 2. If that happens, it means you have focused too much around process only and not on technology skills or any of the other components that is relevant within COBIT. This is also exactly how the whole process and maturity assessment works. It first looks at the processes itself and then looks at the other focus areas to ultimately determine a level of maturity. Good. So that's my friends, brings us towards the end of our second module. So module number 2 was basically a bit of a recap of the entire foundation course, but then just within an hour and a half. And what we discussed is the structure of the framework, what were the 40 different governance and management objectives subdivided into the 1 governance domain and the 4 management domains. We looked at the 7 components of the governance system. We looked at the various design factors that provide an input towards your governance system. We looked at the focus areas, which are the basically functional areas and logical combinations within COBIT itself. And last but not least, we looked at performance measurement based on both capability levels as well as maturity levels. So that's a very brief summary of everything that we've covered in the second module. And that is also a perfect moment to end our session this morning. Before we go and break, are there any questions around the module so far? Was this useful?
Yes. By the way, Chen, I just would like to suggest you just give us a little bit more understanding regarding to the focus area. Since focus area is new, and I found that we have like a DevOps, so I suppose that in the DevOps we should have another framework to manage the DevOps as well. So I just would like to understand more how to manage, since we have look like 2 different framework between the COBIT and DevOps. So just in depth, how could we manage both framework together in the same time?
Yeah, I fully agree. I will focus on that in this afternoon. What this first module is doing mostly is kind of giving you a recap so that it's a bit of a refresh of all of the elements we haven't really talked about tailoring yet and about how to make COBIT practical. And that's what we're going to be doing in our next module.